Donc cet après-midi est consacré à des dimensions un peu plus techniques en lien avec les discussions plus politiques de ce matin. Pour la première demi-heure de l'après-midi, on va passer en anglais. I'm going to switch to English because Rob Stavins, our special guest this afternoon, will give his special address in English, and so be prepared to ask questions in English. So we will interact with him, and we will have some time for discussion. So let me introduce you to Rob. Rob is professor of business and government at the Kennedy School of the Harvard University. He's also director of the Harvard Environmental Economics program. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's also a fellow of the famous Resource for the Future. And I mean, he is very well known for his research in environmental economics in general. I believe he has the best blog you could imagine on the international negotiation of climate change. So if you type Rob Stavins, you will have a free access to the blog, which is always very, very interesting and insightful about what's the current politics in the domain of fundamental economics in general and climate change in particular. So he also wrote several scientific articles and books that I recommend, he's also a consultant to U.S. government agencies, international organizations, corporations, and advocacy group. So Rob will talk for 25 minutes on carbon pricing and international agreement. Rob, the floor is yours.
Do I have a clicker? Thank you very much, Christian. I'm delighted to be here. On what is unfortunately a very brief visit, but it's wonderful to see a few old friends and to meet lots of people that I've not had the privilege of meeting before. This morning, and again later this afternoon, you will be participating in some very interesting discussions about what might be an ideal international climate agreement. What I'm going to talk about is to introduce a bit of reality into the conversation, at least temporarily, and I'm going to talk about how carbon pricing can and perhaps is even likely to be included under the umbrella of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So, first of all, I want to get out of the way, because it will be important, two scientific realities. One is the reality that you all know about the spatial dimension of greenhouse gases, namely that they mix in the atmosphere and that therefore the impacts are independent from the location of the emissions. That turns out to be very important economically and geopolitically, because it means that any jurisdiction taking action pays the direct costs of its actions, but the benefits, the climate benefits of its actions, are spread globally. And that, of course, then means that for any individual jurisdiction, the direct climate benefits of its actions are inevitably less, indeed much, much less than the direct costs of its actions. That's the nature of a global commons problem. That is what creates the free rider issue. Even though it is the case that the global benefits of action would be greater than the global costs of action. So that's the reason why we even are here to talk about international policy. It's not an issue that can be left up to individual nation states to deal with. Now, I say international action is required, but not global action, as I'll emphasize going forward. The other scientific reality is the temporal dimension, which is also important for thinking about the negotiations, and that is the atmospheric lifetime of greenhouse gases, at least most of the important ones, are very long. In the case of carbon dioxide, we're talking decades to a century or more. And that means that international climate policy is really what I'd call a marathon, not a sprint, for 4 reasons. So scientifically, first of all, it's a stock, not a flow environmental problem. The damages are a function of the stock, the accumulated emissions essentially, not the flow at any point in time. Economically, every analysis that I've seen, with one exception, which is Nick Stern's work, but every other analysis indicates that the cost-effective path to achieving the kinds of targets that are talked about, including trying to keep concentrations below 450 parts per million, which will not happen. It's not achievable, but it is politically discussed, that the cost-effective path for achieving any of those targets involves a gradual ramp up in target severity globally. I'm not saying for all countries. For some countries it would be more abrupt. For some countries there would be increased emissions. And the reason for this is that if you have a stock problem, then in order to avoid unnecessary premature capital obsolescence for no good reason, then you want to ramp up slowly rather than being very aggressive in the short term and then leveling out. The third reason is also economic, is that clearly in order to achieve the kinds of targets people talk about, a massive amount of technological change is going to be required. I don't mean just diffusion of existing technologies. I'm talking about invention and innovation of new ones. That requires long-term price signals. And finally, administratively, the creation of durable international institutions is going to be essential. So think back to Bretton Woods at the end of World War II and how long it took us to get these institutions called the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And this is an even greater challenge than that. It's not something in which the institutions come out of the gate with perfection, which is certainly not the case with the UNFCCC. So I look at the climate negotiations as an ongoing process, not a single task with a clear endpoint. I think a sensible goal for Paris, therefore, is to build a sound foundation for long-term action, not to try to solve the problem, because that simply is not going to happen. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is based upon some research of my own, but I want to give credit. It's also based upon research of many, many others, from something I direct called the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. Our mission is to help the negotiating countries of the world identify the key design elements of a post-Kyoto, essentially, international policy architecture that's scientifically sound, economically rational, and therefore perhaps more likely to be politically pragmatic. By scientifically sound, I'm referring to something like 450 parts per million, 2 degrees C. By economically rational, I'm referring to cost effectiveness. And by politically pragmatic, I'm referring to something that the United States and China could actually participate in, since otherwise it's not politically useful. I'm drawing on the research then from quite a few people, academia, private industry, NGOs, and governments. We've got 65 research initiatives in Argentina, Australia, China, Europe, India, Japan, and the United States. I'm not going to drag you through those. What I'm going to just state are 4 lessons that it seems to me when I reflect on 65 very different research projects, economics, political science, legal scholarship. What are some common threads? The first one is that market-based approaches are essential at the national and the subnational level. In other words, carbon pricing, also greenhouse gas pricing, but mainly carbon pricing, and that this could be either through carbon taxes or through some kind of carbon trading, cap and trade mechanisms. Secondly, getting the carbon prices right is necessary, but it's not sufficient, and that's because, as you know, there are other market failures. For example, the public good nature of information, which leads to an insufficient amount of basic R&D being done, even with what would otherwise be the right Pigouvian tax or the right price signals. So there's a reason for certain kinds of supplementary policies.